the fields that fed a kingdom. As the morning grows brighter, it is time to leave the village behind and walk toward the fields. For medieval farmers, the fields were more than a workplace. They were the foundation of survival. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of porridge, and every cup of ale began here. The amount of land a family worked varied greatly. Some farmers controlled relatively large plots. Others possessed only a few narrow strips scattered across different fields. In many villages, land was divided according to a system that had developed over generations. Rather than owning one large piece of farmland, a family might cultivate several smaller strips spread throughout the countryside. At first glance, this arrangement seems inconvenient. Why walk from one field to another when everything could be located in a single place? Yet the system helped distribute both good and poor land among village families. If one section suffered from poor soil, another might be more productive. In theory, this offered a measure of fairness. The landscape surrounding a medieval village often looked very different from the fields we know today. Modern farms frequently consist of large, clearly defined areas worked by machines. Medieval fields were smaller and shaped by centuries of human labor. Hedges, paths, streams, and boundaries divided the land. The work itself was relentless. Much of it depended upon simple hand tools: axes, spades, hoes, wooden rakes, and perhaps most importantly the plow. The plow transformed soil and prepared it for planting. In Northern Europe, heavier plows became increasingly common during the Middle Ages. These powerful tools could cut through dense soils that had once been difficult to farm. But operating a plow was not easy. Oxen often provided the strength needed to pull it. These animals moved slowly but steadily. A team of oxen represented enormous value to a farming community. Without them, preparing large fields became far more difficult. As farmers guided plows across the earth, furrows stretched behind them. Hour after hour, they walked beside animals beneath open skies. The labor required patience. The work required endurance. And the results would not be visible for many months. Unlike many forms of labor, farming demanded faith in the future. A seed planted today would not become food tomorrow. The rewards of work remained hidden beneath the soil. Farmers therefore lived in constant partnership with uncertainty. The weather could change. Pests could arrive. Disease could spread. A season that began with great promise could end in the endless cycle of the seasons. For a medieval farmer, no 2 months were exactly alike. The work changed constantly as the year moved from one season to the next. Yet the cycle itself remained familiar. Generation after generation followed the same rhythm. Spring brought hope. Summer brought labor. Autumn brought urgency. Winter brought preparation. Every season carried its own responsibilities. And every season carried its own dangers. As winter loosened its grip on the countryside, farmers turned their attention toward planting. The fields that had rested through the colder months needed attention once again. The soil was broken. Seeds were gathered. Tools were repaired. Animals were prepared for another demanding year. The arrival of spring was often welcomed with relief. Food stores were frequently at their lowest point. The months before harvest could be difficult. Some historians even refer to this period as the hungry season. Last year's grain supplies might be running short. Fresh crops had not yet matured. Families had to stretch whatever food remained. This made the successful planting of new crops especially important. A good spring offered hope for better months ahead. A bad spring could threaten the entire year. Farmers planted a variety of crops depending on their region. Wheat was highly valued. Barley was common. Rye grew well in many areas. Oats provided food for both people and animals. Peas and beans added variety to diets that were often repetitive. Every seed placed into the ground represented an investment in the future. But planting was only the beginning. As spring transformed into summer, the workload intensified. Fields required constant attention. Weeds competed with crops. Animals needed care. Fences required maintenance. Tools broke and needed repair. The work seemed endless. Days became longer. The sun climbed higher. Farmers spent countless hours outdoors beneath changing skies. There were few opportunities for rest. The growing season was too important. A single neglected task could create problems later. As summer progressed, people watched their crops carefully. They looked for signs of disease. They worried about storms. They hoped for rain when conditions became dry. Yet too much rain could be just as dangerous. Nature offered no guarantees. By late summer and early autumn, attention shifted toward harvest. This was among the busiest periods of the entire year. Now the rewards of months of labor could finally be seen. Fields of grain stood ready. But harvesting had to be done quickly. A sudden storm could destroy crops. Heavy rain could damage grain before animals were wealth on four legs. For many medieval farmers, animals were just as important as crops. In some cases, they were even more valuable. A family might survive a poor harvest. But losing an important animal could create serious problems for years to come. Livestock represented food, labor, transportation, clothing, and wealth. To modern eyes, a medieval village may appear simple. Yet behind nearly every cottage stood animals that played an essential role in daily life. The most valuable animals were often oxen. Large, strong, and patient, oxen provided the power needed to pull heavy plows through dense soil. Without them, preparing fields became much more difficult. A team of healthy oxen could dramatically increase a farmer's productivity. Because they were so valuable, villagers often cared for them with great attention. Horses also appeared in medieval farming communities. However, horses were generally more expensive to maintain. Many ordinary farmers relied on oxen instead. Their slower pace was balanced by their strength and reliability. Cows provided another important resource. Milk could be consumed directly. It could also be transformed into butter and cheese. These foods often lasted longer than fresh milk and provided valuable nutrition throughout the year. For many families, a healthy cow represented security. She provided something useful nearly every day. Pigs were especially popular among medieval villagers. Unlike cattle, pigs required less pasture. They could forage for food in forests and woodlands. Acorns, roots, and fallen plants often became part of their diet. As a result, pigs were relatively economical to raise. When slaughtered, they supplied a significant amount of meat. Little was wasted. Nearly every part of the animal found a purpose. Chickens were perhaps the most common animals in many villages. They required relatively little space. They provided eggs. And occasionally meat. Children often helped care for them. Their constant movement and noise became a familiar part of village life. Sheep were also highly important. Their wool supported one of medieval Europe's most significant industries. Clothing depended heavily upon wool. A flock of sheep represented not only food but also future garments, blankets, and trade opportunities. Women, children, and the work of the farm. When people imagine medieval farming, they often picture men plowing fields beneath wide open skies. And indeed, many men spent long hours performing physically demanding agricultural labor. But medieval farming was never the work of men alone. Entire families participated. Women, children, grandparents. Everyone contributed. Without this shared effort, many farms simply could not survive. The daily responsibilities of medieval women were extensive. Much of their work took place close to home, but that did not make it any less important. Women prepared meals, baked bread, fetched water, maintained fires, spun wool, made clothing, cared for children, and looked after smaller animals. These tasks required countless hours. Yet women also worked directly in the fields. During busy seasons, especially planting and harvest, additional labor was essential. Women sowed seeds, gathered crops, collected vegetables, carried sheaves of grain, and helped preserve food for winter. In many villages, the distinction between household work and farm work hardly existed. Both formed part of the same struggle for survival. Children, too, began working at an early age. Modern ideas of childhood differed greatly from medieval expectations. Young children certainly played, but they also learned responsibilities from an early age. A 6-year-old might watch chickens. An 8-year-old might collect firewood. Older children could herd animals, carry water, or help during harvest. Learning occurred through participation. There were no instruction manuals. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next through observation and experience. Children watched adults. Adults corrected mistakes. Gradually, essential skills became familiar. As children grew older, their responsibilities increased. By adolescence, many young people performed work nearly identical to that of adults. For families living near the edge of subsistence, every pair of hands mattered. Grandparents often remained active as well. Although advancing age limited certain tasks, older family members still possessed valuable knowledge. They remembered difficult winters, poor harvests, floods, and famines. Their experience guided younger generations through uncertain times. Life on a medieval farm therefore revolved around cooperation. No individual could accomplish lords, rents, and the price of living on the land. Although medieval farmers worked the fields, they did not always own the land beneath their feet. In much of medieval Europe, land belonged to lords. Some lords were nobles. Others were monasteries, bishops, or powerful religious institutions. Farmers lived and worked on these lands in exchange for certain obligations. To modern people, this arrangement may seem unusual. Yet for medieval villagers, it formed an ordinary part of life. Most farming families expected to owe something to their lord. The exact obligations varied from region to region. Some farmers paid rent in grain. Others paid with livestock. Some provided labor instead of goods. Many did all three. A peasant might spend several days each week working not on his own fields, but on the Lord's land. These days of labor were known by different names across Europe. Whatever the name, the result remained the same. Part of a farmer's time belonged to someone else. Imagine spending Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday tending your own crops. Then spending Thursday and Friday plowing, harvesting, or repairing fences for your Lord. Only afterward could you return to your own work. For medieval families, balancing these responsibilities required careful planning. Falling behind on obligations could result in fines. Life within the manor revolved around this relationship between lord and peasant. The manor was both an economic and social unit. Fields, pastures, woodlands, mills, and sometimes entire villages formed part of a lord's estate. At the center often stood a manor house or small castle. Nearby, ordinary villagers lived in timber cottages with thatched roofs. Farmers depended upon resources controlled by the lord. Many villagers used the lord's mill to grind grain into flour. For this service, they usually paid a fee. The same was true of ovens, wine presses, and other essential facilities, what medieval farmers actually ate. After a long day spent working in fields, caring for animals, repairing tools, or gathering firewood, medieval farmers eventually returned home. And like people in every age, they needed something to eat. Modern films often portray medieval banquets overflowing with roasted meats, pies, and endless wine. But for ordinary farmers, daily meals were usually much simpler. In fact, many medieval peasants ate remarkably modest diets. Bread formed the foundation of most meals. It was difficult to imagine life without it. Families consumed bread at breakfast, midday, and supper. The type of bread varied according to wealth, region, and harvest quality. The wealthy preferred fine white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour. Most ordinary farmers, however, ate darker breads made from rye, barley, oats, or mixed grains. These loaves tended to be dense and filling. Some historians estimate that medieval peasants consumed astonishing quantities of bread each year. Alongside bread came pottage. Pottage was perhaps the most common medieval dish. It was a thick stew prepared in a large pot suspended above the household fire. Vegetables, beans, peas, onions, herbs, grains. Almost anything edible might find its way into the pot. The ingredients changed according to the season. And because cooking fuel required effort to gather, families often kept pottage simmering continuously for days. Fresh ingredients could simply be added as needed. Meat appeared less frequently than many people imagine. Most peasants could not afford to slaughter valuable livestock regularly. Animals represented labor, milk, wool, or future wealth. Killing them was rarely done without reason. Pork occasionally appeared. So did salted or smoked meats during special occasions. But everyday meals relied heavily upon grains and vegetables. Dairy products provided important nutrition. Milk, butter, cheese, and curds appeared in many households. Illness, hardship, and surviving bad years. Life for medieval farmers was closely tied to the land. And because of this, life could change very quickly. A season of good weather might bring abundant harvests. But a season of heavy rain, drought, disease, or war could bring hardship. For many farming families, survival was never guaranteed. Illness represented one of the greatest dangers. Modern medicine did not exist. There were no antibiotics, no hospitals as we know them, and little understanding of how disease spread. When someone became sick, families relied upon traditional remedies. Herbs gathered from gardens or forests were commonly used. Certain plants were believed to ease pain. Others were thought to reduce fever. Some treatments probably offered genuine relief. Others likely did very little. Yet families used whatever knowledge they possessed. Village-wise women and healers often played important roles. Experience passed from generation to generation. People learned which herbs soothed coughs, which plants treated wounds, and which remedies should be avoided. Still, many illnesses remained mysterious. A simple infection could become deadly. An injury received while chopping wood or harvesting grain might lead to serious complications. Even childbirth carried considerable risks. For women especially, pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous parts of life. Many children never reached adulthood. Infant mortality remained tragically common throughout much of the Middle Ages. Parents understood this harsh reality. Even so, the loss of a child brought profound grief. Disease sometimes affected entire communities. Outbreaks of fever, dysentery, or other illnesses could spread rapidly through villages. Poor sanitation often worsened conditions. People lived in close proximity. Animals frequently shared space with humans. Clean drinking water was not always available. Then there were famines. A failed harvest could create difficulties for an entire region. Several poor harvests in succession could produce catastrophe. Food supplies dwindled. Prices increased. Families ate less. Desperation sometimes followed. History records many periods when entire populations suffered from hunger. Weather itself could become an enemy. A violent storm might flatten crops just before harvest. Late frosts could kill young plants. Floods could wash away precious farmland. Drought could leave fields barren. Farmers carefully observed the skies because their livelihoods depended upon forces beyond their control. War brought additional hardships. Armies marching through the countryside often consumed crops, seized livestock, or damaged villages. For peasants, conflicts between kings and nobles frequently meant disruption and suffering. Yet despite these hardships, medieval farming communities endured. They adapted. They shared resources. They relied upon neighbors. And they continued planting, harvesting, and rebuilding. Life was uncertain. But resilience became part of everyday existence. The following spring would eventually arrive. Seeds would once again be planted. And the cycle of rural life would continue. Village festivals and holy days. Although medieval farmers spent much of their lives working, life was not entirely without celebration. Scattered throughout the year were special days that offered a welcome break from ordinary labor. These occasions were eagerly anticipated. For medieval villagers, festivals and holy days brought opportunities to rest, worship, socialize, and briefly forget the endless demands of farming. The church played a central role in medieval life. Its calendar shaped the rhythm of the year just as surely as the changing seasons. Christmas, Easter, saints' feast days, harvest celebrations. all held deep religious significance. But they also provided precious moments of joy. Church bells often announced the beginning of these celebrations. Their sound carried across fields and villages alike. For farmers laboring far from home, the ringing bells signaled that something different was about to happen. Work might pause. Neighbors would gather. The village would come alive. Attendance at church services formed an important part of many celebrations. Entire families dressed in their best clothing. Though best clothing, for peasants remained simple by modern standards, special garments were often carefully preserved for these occasions. The church itself served not only as a place of worship, but also as the social heart of the community. Here villagers exchanged news, arranged marriages, discussed harvest prospects, and strengthened social bonds. After religious services, festivities sometimes continued outdoors. Villages might organize communal meals. Musicians played flutes, drums, or simple stringed instruments. Dancing occasionally followed. Children ran through village streets. Neighbors shared food and drink. For people accustomed to hard physical labor, such moments offered welcome relief. Seasonal festivals held particular importance. Harvest festivals celebrated the successful gathering of crops. After months of uncertainty, communities finally knew whether they would have enough food for winter. A good harvest brought gratitude. A poor harvest brought concern. Either way, the occasion was marked. Markets and fairs frequently accompanied major celebrations. Merchants traveled from distant towns. Exotic goods occasionally appeared. Spices, cloth, tools, or unusual trinkets. For many villagers, fairs represented rare opportunities to encounter people from beyond their immediate surroundings. Stories traveled alongside goods. News from distant regions spread from traveler to traveler. Young people also welcomed festivals. Courtships often began during communal celebrations. Under watchful eyes, young men and women found opportunities to speak, dance, and become acquainted. Many future marriages may have had their beginnings during village festivals. Yet celebrations eventually ended. The music faded. Guests departed. And ordinary routines returned. The fields still required attention. Animals still needed care. Life continued. But these special days offered something precious. A reminder that even amid hardship, there remained room for joy, community, and hope. For me, inside a medieval farmer's home. After spending long hours in fields, pastures, or village lanes, medieval farmers eventually returned home. But home in the Middle Ages looked very different from the homes many people know today. Most ordinary farming families lived in modest cottages. These houses were built using materials that could be found nearby: wood, clay, straw, and sometimes stone. The appearance of a cottage depended largely upon local resources. In heavily forested regions, timber was abundant. Elsewhere, stone might be more common. Many peasant homes were constructed using a technique known as wattle and daub. Wooden strips were woven together to create walls. These walls were then covered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. Though simple, such buildings could last for many years if carefully maintained. Roofs were often thatched. Bundles of straw or reeds provided insulation from rain and cold. However, thatched roofs also presented dangers. They could catch fire. They attracted insects. And they required regular repair. Inside, space was limited. A single room frequently served many purposes. It was a kitchen, a dining room, a workplace, and a bedroom. Entire families shared this space. Privacy, as modern people understand it, was rare. At the center of the home stood the hearth. The hearth provided warmth, light, and a place for cooking. Throughout much of the year, a fire burned almost constantly. Keeping the fire alive was an important daily responsibility. Without it, cooking became difficult and winter nights became uncomfortable. Smoke from the hearth often escaped through a simple opening in the roof. Chimneys were uncommon in many peasant homes. As a result, interiors could become smoky. Walls and ceilings gradually darkened from years of soot. Furniture remained simple. Wooden benches, rough tables, stools, chests for storing possessions. Most families owned relatively few items. Every object served a practical purpose. Beds were equally modest. Some people slept on wooden frames filled with straw. Others slept on mattresses stuffed with dried grasses. Blankets were valuable possessions. Entire families sometimes slept close together for warmth. Animals occasionally shared the home as well. Bringing livestock indoors during winter offered protection from thieves, predators, and severe weather. Though this arrangement may seem strange today, it provided important advantages. The animals themselves also contributed warmth. Despite their simplicity, medieval cottages represented security. Within these walls, meals were shared. Stories were told. Children were raised. And families found shelter from the uncertainties of the outside world. As darkness settled across the countryside and the fire crackled gently within the hearth, the cottage became a place of comfort. Small, crowded, sometimes smoky. Yet for medieval farmers it was home. Fire, light, and staying warm. For medieval farmers, the setting sun brought a very different world. Without electricity, darkness arrived quickly. And once darkness settled over the countryside, daily life slowed considerably. The simple act of creating light required effort. Keeping warm required even more. Throughout the Middle Ages, fire stood at the center of domestic life. A cottage without a fire was cold, dark, and uncomfortable. The hearth provided warmth. It cooked meals. It dried wet clothing. It illuminated the room. And it became the gathering place of the household. Maintaining a fire was an important responsibility. Starting a new fire from scratch could be difficult and time-consuming. Because of this, families often tried to keep embers burning continuously. Each morning, the fire could be revived rather than completely rebuilt. Fuel was precious. Wood needed to be collected, chopped, and stored. Children frequently helped gather sticks and branches. Larger logs required considerable effort to cut and transport. During winter, families paid close attention to their supplies. A shortage of firewood could make the cold season extremely unpleasant. Light itself was limited. Most peasant homes did not possess large numbers of candles. Candles made from beeswax were valuable and often associated with churches and wealthy households. Ordinary villagers commonly relied upon tallow candles made from animal fat. These produced a dimmer light, and sometimes unpleasant odors. Oil lamps were also used in certain places. Yet even with these sources of illumination, nights remained dark by modern standards. People adjusted their lives accordingly. After supper, families gathered near the hearth. Some repaired clothing. Others prepared tools for the next day. Stories were told. Songs were sung. Prayers were spoken. And eventually, tired bodies prepared for sleep. Winter brought particular challenges. Cold winds entered through cracks in walls. Snow and ice transformed the landscape outside. Blankets and warm clothing became essential. Families often slept close together for warmth. Animals sheltered nearby could contribute additional heat. Despite these hardships, people developed countless small strategies for enduring the cold. Extra straw covered floors. Heavy cloth hung across doorways. Hot stones occasionally warmed beds. Experience taught people how to survive long winters. For medieval farmers, warmth represented comfort. Light represented security. And the glow of the evening hearth offered a welcome end to another demanding day. As the fire slowly died down and the cottage grew quiet, darkness once again covered the village. Tomorrow would bring new work. But tonight, the only sounds were the crackling embers and the distant wind outside. Clothing, wool, and everyday dress. When modern people imagine the Middle Ages, they often picture kings dressed in velvet, noblewomen wearing elaborate gowns, and knights shining in polished armor. But medieval farmers dressed very differently. Their clothing was practical. It needed to provide warmth. It needed to last. And above all, it needed to withstand long days of hard physical labor. For most farming families, clothing represented a valuable possession. Unlike today, new garments could not simply be purchased whenever needed. Every piece of clothing required enormous amounts of work. The process often began with sheep. Throughout much of medieval Europe, sheep were among the most important farm animals. They will form the foundation of everyday clothing. Each year, usually during spring or early summer, sheep were carefully sheared. Villagers removed thick winter fleeces using large hand shears. The work demanded patience and skill. Once collected, the wool required extensive preparation. It needed cleaning. Washing removed dirt, grease, and plant material. Afterward, the wool was combed or carded. This separated and aligned the fibers. Only then could spinning begin. Spinning transformed loose wool into thread. Women frequently performed this task. Many spent countless hours beside the hearth spinning yarn using simple tools such as drop spindles or spinning wheels. The work was repetitive, but it was essential. Without thread, there could be no cloth. After spinning came weaving. Large wooden looms converted thread into fabric. Producing enough cloth for an entire family represented a major undertaking. As a result, garments were carefully maintained. Clothes were repaired repeatedly. Patches covered worn areas. Torn sleeves were mended. Nothing useful was wasted. The clothing itself remained simple. Men commonly wore tunics extending to the knee. Loose trousers or hose covered their legs. Women generally wore long dresses or gowns with aprons. Colors varied. Natural dyes produced shades of brown, gray, green, blue, and muted red. Bright colors existed but were often more expensive. Footwear presented another challenge. Leather shoes protected feet from mud, stones, and cold. Yet shoes wore out quickly. Some people walked barefoot during warmer months, particularly while working in fields. Winter demanded additional layers. Heavy woolen cloaks, hoods, and extra garments helped protect against freezing temperatures. Warm clothing could make the difference between comfort and misery. Special clothing was often reserved for festivals, weddings, and church services. Families carefully stored these garments, wearing them only on important occasions. Ordinary work clothes, meanwhile, endured daily use. By evening, clothing might be stained with mud, smoke, sweat, or animal hair. Yet these garments represented far more than simple fabric. They reflected countless hours of labor. The sheep that provided wool. The hands that spun thread. The families that patiently stitched every seam. For medieval farmers, clothing was not disposable. It was precious. And every thread carried a story. Market day in the medieval village. For medieval farmers, most days revolved around the fields. Yet from time to time, ordinary routines gave way to something rather different. Market day. These occasions brought excitement, opportunity, and sometimes a welcome break from agricultural labor. Markets formed an essential part of medieval economic life. Although many farming families attempted to produce much of what they needed themselves, complete self-sufficiency was rarely possible. Certain goods simply had to be obtained elsewhere. Salt, iron tools, pottery, cloth, and countless other necessities. For this reason, villages and towns throughout medieval Europe hosted regular markets. Some occurred weekly. Others took place only a few times each year. Preparations often began before sunrise. Farmers loaded carts with produce they hoped to sell. Eggs, cheese, butter, vegetables, wool, or perhaps surplus grain. Whatever could spare a family a few extra coins was worth bringing. The journey itself could take hours. People traveled on foot, by cart, or occasionally on horseback. Roads were rarely smooth. Mud, ruts, and poor weather often made travel difficult. Yet despite these inconveniences, market day remained eagerly anticipated. Upon arriving, villagers encountered sights, sounds, and smells quite unlike those found at home. Stalls lined streets and market squares. Merchants loudly advertised their wares. Animals bleated. Children played. The smell of bread, livestock, smoke, and fresh produce filled the air. For many rural people, markets provided rare opportunities to see large gatherings of strangers. Traders sometimes arrived from distant regions. Their accents sounded unfamiliar. Their goods seemed exotic. Spices from faraway lands. Brightly colored fabrics. Fine metalwork. Even simple objects could appear remarkable to those accustomed to village life. Buying and selling required skill. Prices were negotiated. Bargains were struck. Disagreements occasionally occurred. Experienced farmers understood the value of their produce and attempted to secure fair exchanges. Markets also served important social purposes. Friends met. News spread. Announcements were made. Marriages arranged. Stories exchanged. In a world without newspapers, telephones, or the internet, markets functioned as centers of communication. People learned of political events, local disputes, distant wars, and changing conditions. Not everyone visited solely for business. Entertainers sometimes appeared. Musicians performed. Storytellers gathered audiences. Festive fairs occasionally accompanied important market days. But eventually, purchases were completed. Carts were reloaded. And villagers began the long journey home. The fields still awaited. Animals still required feeding. Life returned to familiar routines. Yet market day had briefly connected medieval farmers to a much larger world beyond their own village boundaries. The tools of the medieval farmer. A medieval farmer's livelihood depended not only upon the land, but also upon the tools used to work it. Without proper tools, even the most fertile fields could prove difficult to cultivate. Yet compared with modern machinery, medieval farming equipment remained remarkably simple. Most tools were made primarily from wood. Wood was widely available. It could be shaped by local craftsmen. And damaged parts could often be repaired rather than replaced. However, many essential tools also required iron. Blacksmiths played a vital role in rural communities. Their workshops produced plowshares, sickles, knives, horseshoes, and countless other metal objects. One of the most important farming tools was the plow. Early medieval plows varied considerably across Europe. In lighter soils, simple wooden plows might be sufficient. But in regions with heavy clay soils, larger and stronger plows became necessary. The heavy-wheeled plow represented a significant innovation in parts of northern Europe. Pulled by teams of oxen or horses, it cut deep furrows into the earth. Preparing fields for planting required many additional tools. Farmers used hoes to break up soil and remove weeds. Wooden harrows, often fitted with iron teeth, helped smooth fields after plowing. Rakes gathered loose material. Spades and shovels assisted with digging. Each tool had a specific purpose. Harvest season introduced another set of essential implements. Sickles and scythes were indispensable. A sickle consisted of a short, curved blade. Farmers used it to cut grain by hand. Scythes, with their longer handles and sweeping blades, allowed workers to harvest larger areas more quickly. Even so, harvesting remained exhausting labor. Storage and transport also required equipment. Wooden carts carried crops, firewood, manure, and supplies. Wheelwrights constructed and repaired wagon wheels. Ropes, baskets, sacks, and barrels ensured that produce could be safely stored and transported. Animals, too, depended upon specialized equipment. Harnesses connected horses or oxen to plows and carts. Yokes distributed weight evenly across teams of oxen. Poorly designed equipment could injure valuable animals or reduce efficiency. Many tools represented considerable investments. Iron was expensive. As a result, farmers carefully maintained their equipment. Broken handles were replaced. Metal blades were sharpened repeatedly. Nothing useful was discarded unnecessarily. Tools often passed from one generation to the next. A son might inherit the same plow once used by his father. Years of labor left visible marks upon these objects. Smooth wooden handles. Worn blades. Repaired joints. Every tool carried evidence of countless seasons spent working the land. To modern eyes, medieval farming tools may appear primitive. Yet in skilled hands, they sustained entire communities. And for centuries, these simple implements helped feed Europe. marriage and family life. For medieval farmers, family stood at the very center of daily life. The household was not simply a place to live. It was also a workplace, a source of security, and often the key to survival. Life on a medieval farm required many hands. Fields needed plowing. Animals required care. Food had to be prepared. Clothing needed repair. Children, parents, and grandparents frequently worked together to accomplish these tasks. Marriage therefore carried great importance. Unlike modern ideas of romantic love, medieval marriages often involved practical considerations. Families considered land, property, labor, and social connections. A successful marriage could strengthen both households. However, affection and companionship certainly existed. Many couples undoubtedly developed deep bonds over years spent sharing life's hardships and responsibilities. The age at which people married varied considerably. In many regions, men and women married in their 20s. This often occurred after they had acquired sufficient resources to establish a household. Marriage ceremonies usually took place at the local church. The event represented both a religious and community occasion. Relatives, friends, and neighbors frequently attended. Following the ceremony, celebrations often included feasting, music, dancing, and storytelling. Although medieval peasant weddings were generally modest compared with noble celebrations, they nevertheless provided rare opportunities for festivity. Once married, couples faced numerous responsibilities. Running a household demanded constant effort. Men frequently focused upon plowing, heavy agricultural work, and maintaining tools. Women commonly prepared food, cared for children, managed household tasks, tended gardens, and often assisted with farm labor as well. Yet these divisions were rarely absolute. During busy seasons, everyone contributed wherever necessary. Children formed an essential part of family life. From an early age, boys and girls learned practical skills by observing adults. Young children might collect eggs, gather firewood, or scare birds away from crops. As they grew older, responsibilities increased. Childhood in the medieval countryside involved work, but it also included games, stories, and moments of play. Families faced significant challenges: illness, crop failures, harsh winters, and sadly, high rates of infant mortality. The loss of children was an all too common tragedy. Despite these hardships, strong family networks helped communities endure difficult times. Grandparents often remained important members of the household. Several generations sometimes lived under one roof or in neighboring cottages. Elders passed down knowledge about farming, weather, customs, and local traditions. In a world without schools for most people, much learning occurred within the family. For medieval farmers, home represented far more than shelter. It was where work and family became inseparable, where traditions passed from one generation to the next, and where life, in all its joys and sorrows, unfolded. Growing old on the medieval farm. For medieval farmers, old age was both a privilege and a challenge. Life in the countryside demanded years of hard physical labor. From childhood onward, farmers worked in fields, cared for animals, carried heavy loads, and endured harsh weather. By the time a person reached old age, their body often bore the unmistakable marks of a lifetime spent working the land. many people never lived to see old age at all. Disease, accidents, poor harvests, and periodic famine meant that life expectancy was often lower than it is today. Yet those who survived into their later years occupied an important place within medieval communities. Elderly farmers possessed something highly valuable: experience. Decades spent observing the seasons had taught them countless lessons. They knew which fields drained poorly after heavy rain. They remembered particularly harsh winters. They understood local customs, traditions, and family histories. Such knowledge could not easily be replaced. As physical strength gradually declined, older villagers often shifted to less demanding tasks. While younger family members plowed fields and harvested crops, elders might tend gardens, care for poultry, repair tools, spin wool, or watch young children. Their contributions remained essential. Grandparents frequently played a significant role in raising children. Stories, songs, prayers, and practical knowledge passed from one generation to the next beside the hearth fire. Children learned not only farming techniques, but also community values and traditions. Old age, however, brought difficulties. Medical care remained limited. Arthritis, poor eyesight, tooth loss, and chronic pain likely affected many older people. Even relatively minor injuries could become serious. Simple tasks that had once seemed effortless often required increasing assistance. Family support therefore became especially important. In many villages, elderly parents continued living with their children or nearby relatives. The household functioned as a network of mutual support. Younger members cared for aging relatives, just as older generations had once cared for them. Nevertheless, not every elderly person enjoyed such security. Widows and widowers without family support sometimes faced hardship. Communities, churches, and neighbors occasionally provided assistance, though resources were often limited. Religion also assumed greater importance during old age. As people approached the final stages of life, thoughts increasingly turned toward salvation, death, and the afterlife. Prayer, confession, and participation in religious rituals offered comfort. Growing old in medieval Europe was rarely easy. Yet old age brought respect. Elders represented memory. They connected the living to the past. And within the quiet cottages of medieval villages, their wisdom helped guide future generations. As evening shadows lengthened and another day drew to a close, older farmers could look back upon lives, death and burial in medieval villages. Death was a familiar presence in medieval life. For farmers living in the countryside, life could be uncertain. Disease, accidents, harsh winters, poor harvests, and periodic outbreaks of famine all reminded people that life was fragile. Unlike many people today, medieval villagers encountered death regularly. Children, adults, and the elderly alike faced dangers that modern medicine has greatly reduced. As a result, death was woven into the fabric of everyday life. Religion shaped how medieval people understood death. Most villagers believed that earthly life represented only one stage in a much longer spiritual journey. The fate of the soul after death occupied an important place in medieval thought. Prayer, confession, and participation in church rituals were considered essential preparations for the afterlife. When someone became seriously ill, family members often gathered nearby. The local priest might be summoned to hear confession and administer final rites. Relatives prayed together. neighbors frequently visited. In small villages, illness and death affected the entire community. When death finally occurred, preparations for burial began quickly. Without modern preservation techniques, burials often took place within a day or two. Family members washed and prepared the body. Simple shrouds commonly replaced elaborate clothing. For most peasants, funerals remained modest affairs. Church bells announced the death to the surrounding community. The funeral procession usually traveled from the home to the local church. Friends, relatives, and neighbors walked together, offering prayers along the way. Burials typically took place in churchyards. These small cemeteries surrounded parish churches throughout medieval Europe. Generations of villagers rested in the same sacred ground. Graves were often simple. Wooden markers sometimes identified burial places, though many eventually disappeared. Unlike wealthy nobles, ordinary farmers rarely possessed elaborate tombs. Yet simplicity did not diminish the significance of the ceremony. Funerals brought communities together. They offered comfort to grieving families, and they reinforced shared religious beliefs. Memories of the deceased continued through stories, family traditions, and prayers. Medieval villagers also remembered the dead during religious festivals and special days of remembrance. The boundaries between the living and the dead often seemed closer than they do today. Ancestors remained an important part of community memory. Death was painful. Families mourned. Children grieved parents. Parents mourned children. Spouses lost lifelong companions. The emotions of loss were no less profound than they are today. Yet medieval farmers also understood that life continued. Fields still required tending. Animals still needed feeding. Seasons continued to change. And in time, new generations took their place within the village. As evening shadows settled quietly over the churchyard and the bells fell silent, life in the medieval countryside moved gently onward, as it had for centuries. A night in the medieval countryside. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, life in the medieval countryside began to change. The busy activities of the day gradually came to an end. Fields grew quiet. Animals settled into barns and pens, and villagers returned home. Night in medieval Europe was very different from night today. Without electric lights, darkness arrived swiftly. Once the last traces of daylight faded, the world became illuminated only by moonlight, starlight, fire, and candle flames. For many people, night carried a sense of mystery. The countryside itself transformed. Familiar paths appeared unfamiliar. Fields vanished into darkness. The distant outlines of trees and cottages became shadows against the night sky. Sounds also changed. During the day, villages echoed with human activity. At night, other voices emerged. Owls called from nearby woods. Dogs barked in the distance. Wind rustled through thatched roofs and tree branches. Crickets sang softly in summer. To modern ears, accustomed to constant noise, the medieval countryside would likely have seemed remarkably quiet. Yet medieval people rarely considered the night entirely peaceful. Darkness inspired both wonder and fear. Many villagers believed that supernatural forces became more active after sunset. Folk tales spoke of spirits, wandering souls, witches, and mysterious creatures. Stories shared beside the hearth often reflected these beliefs. Whether such tales were accepted literally or simply enjoyed as entertainment varied from person to person. Practical concerns also remained. Fire presented a constant danger. A single spark could destroy an entire village of wooden and thatched buildings. Before sleeping, families carefully checked hearth fires. Doors were secured. Animals were counted. Simple routines offered reassurance. Inside cottages, evening activities continued for a time. People repaired clothing, prepared tools, prayed, shared stories, or simply rested after exhausting days of labor. Eventually, one by one, candles were extinguished. The household settled into sleep. Interestingly, historians believe that many medieval people did not always sleep continuously throughout the night. Evidence suggests that some practiced what scholars call segmented sleep. People might sleep for several hours, awaken for a short period around midnight, and then return to sleep until dawn. During these quiet waking hours, individuals sometimes prayed, reflected, spoke with family members, or performed small tasks. Outside, meanwhile, the stars continued their silent journey across the heavens. Far removed from modern cities and artificial lighting, medieval villagers experienced extraordinarily dark skies. The Milky Way stretched brightly overhead. Countless stars filled the night. For farmers whose lives depended upon seasonal rhythms, the heavens held both practical and spiritual significance. And so, beneath those ancient stars, another day in the medieval countryside came gently to an end. Soon enough, morning would return. The rooster would crow. The fire would be rekindled. And life would begin again. How farming changed medieval Europe. For centuries, medieval farmers rose before dawn, worked the land, and returned home at sunset. Their daily routines may have appeared simple. Yet collectively, the labor of millions of ordinary people transformed an entire continent. Agriculture stood at the heart of medieval Europe. Without farmers, there could be no villages, no towns, no castles, and no kingdoms. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of porridge, and every feast ultimately depended upon the work performed in fields across the countryside. During the early Middle Ages, agricultural productivity remained relatively limited. Farmers often struggled to produce sufficient food. Poor harvests could quickly lead to hunger. Yet over time, important changes gradually improved agricultural life. One such innovation was the heavy plow. Particularly in northern Europe, this powerful tool allowed farmers to cultivate dense clay soils that had previously been difficult to farm. As more land became productive, food supplies increased. Another important development involved animal power. Improved horse harnesses and the widespread use of horseshoes enabled horses to work more efficiently. In many regions, horses gradually supplemented or replaced oxen. Fields could be plowed more quickly. Transport became easier. The organization of farming also evolved. Many communities adopted the three-field system. Instead of leaving half the land unused each year, farmers divided fields into 3 sections. One field might contain winter crops, another spring crops, and the third rested. By rotating crops in this way, soil fertility improved and harvests often increased. These innovations did not appear everywhere simultaneously. Change occurred slowly. Generation by generation, village by village. But gradually, agricultural production expanded. As food supplies improved, populations grew. More people survived childhood. Villages expanded. New towns emerged. Trade increased. Markets became busier. Specialized craftsmen appeared. Blacksmiths, millers, merchants, carpenters. Entire economies developed upon agricultural foundations. Surplus food also supported institutions beyond the countryside. Monasteries flourished. Universities eventually emerged. Kings and nobles collected taxes. Armies could be maintained. In many ways, the civilization of medieval Europe rested upon the efforts of farmers. Of course, challenges remained. Famine still occurred. Disease still spread. Weather remained unpredictable. Agricultural life continued to demand relentless labor. Yet despite these hardships, medieval farmers gradually reshaped landscapes across Europe. Forests were cleared. Marshes drained. New fields created. Roads established. The countryside itself bore the marks of human effort. Today, many European landscapes still reflect patterns first as gentle closing reflections and good night. And so, our long journey through the world of medieval farmers gradually comes to an end. Together, we have walked across muddy fields. We have listened to the sounds of village life. We have shared meals beside glowing hearth fires. And we have witnessed the quiet rhythms that shape daily existence for millions of ordinary people. When many of us imagine the Middle Ages, our thoughts often turn toward kings, castles, battles, and great historical events. Yet history was not experienced primarily by kings. It was experienced by farmers, by mothers preparing meals, by children gathering firewood, by fathers repairing tools, by grandparents sharing stories beside the evening fire. For medieval farmers, life was rarely easy. Each year brought uncertainty. Harvests might fail. Animals could become sick. Storms might destroy crops. Winter often tested the limits of endurance. And yet, despite these hardships, medieval communities endured. They adapted. They cooperated. And they found meaning in the familiar patterns of everyday life. The turning of the seasons. The ringing of church bells. The warmth of family. The comfort of shared traditions. Modern life often moves with extraordinary speed. Electric lights banish darkness. Machines perform tasks that once required days of labor. Food arrives from distant places with remarkable ease. And yet, in some ways, the world of medieval farmers may still feel strangely familiar. People still gather around tables. Families still celebrate weddings. Parents still teach children. Communities still come together during times of joy and sorrow. Across the centuries, certain human experiences remain remarkably constant. Perhaps that is one reason why studying ordinary lives from the past can feel so comforting. It reminds us that countless generations before us also experienced hope, uncertainty, love, hardship, and change. And somehow, they continued. As night settles quietly across the medieval countryside one final time, the cottages have grown dark. The hearth fires burn low. Animals sleep peacefully in their shelters. A cool breeze moves gently across the fields. Above, countless stars shine in the clear night sky. Tomorrow, before dawn, the rooster will crow once more. Farmers will rise. Fires will be rekindled. Bread will be baked. And another ordinary day will begin. But for now, the village rests. The fields are silent. And the long labors of the day are finally complete. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey into the medieval past. If you have enjoyed spending this quiet evening exploring history together, you might consider subscribing for more gentle journeys into the lives of ordinary people from long ago. And now, wherever you may be, I hope you are feeling comfortable, peaceful, and perhaps just a little sleepy. So, as the stars continue their slow passage across the night sky, it is time to say good night. Sleep well. And until our next journey into history, good night.